During a highly anticipated congressional hearing focused on media accountability and political bias, a moment unfolded that quickly became the center of national attention. The hearing, which brought together journalists, media analysts, and political commentators, was meant to explore how narratives are shaped in the press and whether conservative voices are being sidelined in mainstream coverage. Among those invited to speak was Karoline Leavitt, a former White House press aide under President Donald Trump and a rising conservative commentator known for her articulate, unapologetic tone. Karoline, in her early 30s, sat poised behind the microphone, ready to deliver her remarks. She was confident but calm, prepared for the usual partisan pushback that tends to accompany these hearings. She'd done this before, offering her perspective, advocating for fair treatment of conservatives in the media, and challenging prevailing narratives about censorship and representation. Her opening comments were measured. She discussed the growing distrust many Americans feel toward major media outlets and cited instances where conservative stories were either ignored or treated with open skepticism. Her words were sharp, but not personal. She criticized patterns of reporting, not people. She referenced data, anecdotes, and her own experience navigating press briefings during a tumultuous time in American politics. As she wrapped up her opening statement, she thanked the committee for the opportunity to speak and took a sip of water, expecting follow-up questions, or perhaps some respectful disagreement. But what followed wasn't a question. It wasn't even policy-related. Rep. Jasmine Crockett, the Democratic Congresswoman from Texas, who had been quietly reviewing notes during Karoline's remarks, suddenly leaned forward and cut in. She didn't adjust her tone for formality, didn't preface her remark with context, and certainly didn't ask for clarification on any of Karoline's points. Instead, she uttered a line that felt more like a classroom dismissal than a congressional inquiry. "Sit down, girl. We've heard enough of your talking points." The words landed hard, not because they were loud, but because of their dismissiveness. The casual nature of the comment caught people off guard. It wasn't just disagreement. It was a public belittling, an open attempt to shut someone down based solely on who they were and how they spoke. The use of the term girl in this context wasn't received as lighthearted or friendly. To many, it carried a tone of condescension, one that subtly undermined Karoline's qualifications and right to be there. The room, filled with reporters and staffers, shifted its attention instantly. A few chuckled nervously, unsure whether it was a joke or a jab. Others stared in surprise, wondering how Karoline would respond. Cameras caught it all, and within seconds, political commentators online began sharing the clip. The remark, "Sit down, girl," began trending on social media, sparking debate over whether Crockett had crossed a line. What made the moment more striking was the contrast in setting. This wasn't a campaign rally or a late-night political panel. This was a formal congressional hearing, a place where ideas, even contentious ones, are meant to be debated with a degree of decorum. And yet, here was an elected official, interrupting a civilian guest not to challenge her points, but to dismiss her presence altogether. The insult didn't reference policy. It didn't engage with Karoline's arguments about bias or suppression. It bypassed all of that and went straight to a personal jab, undermining her identity, not her ideas. For some watching, it represented a larger problem, a shift from debating policy to attacking personalities. It also raised questions about consistency. Many of the same voices that usually call for civility in political discourse seemed quiet in the aftermath. The comment was not condemned by the majority of the party Crockett represented. Instead, some tried to frame it as a heat of the moment quip, something that happens when tempers flare in tense political environments. But viewers across the country saw something different. They saw a young woman trying to express her views in a formal setting, only to be dismissed with a phrase that felt laced with mockery. The fact that Karoline was there as a guest, not a political rival, made it feel even more inappropriate. It wasn't just a jab, it was an attempt to silence, delivered with a smirk and a wave of the hand. And in that moment, it wasn't about party lines. It was about respect. Karoline Leavitt had been insulted on national television, in a room where the expectation was professionalism and mutual respect. The words, "Sit down, girl," still hung in the air, but Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't look shaken. There was a moment, just a second, where she glanced around, briefly acknowledging the weight of what had just been said. Most people would have responded in kind, maybe shot back a sarcastic remark or raised their voice to match the disrespect. But that wasn't Karoline's move. Instead, she leaned slightly toward the microphone, folded her hands in front of her, and responded with a calm steadiness that no one in that room had predicted. Her voice was not loud, but it was deliberate. Every word chosen carefully, every sentence constructed not for applause, but to reclaim her ground with dignity. "Respectfully, Congresswoman," she began, "I was invited here to speak, not to be spoken down to." The room went still. No interruptions, no background noise. Her words immediately reframed the situation. She wasn't throwing jabs or trading insults. She was reminding everyone, including her detractors, why she was there. She didn't demand attention. She commanded it by staying composed. That single sentence, "I was invited here to speak, not to be spoken down to," echoed the thoughts of many watching from home. It was a reminder that public discourse, even when it's messy and combative, should have boundaries. Karoline wasn't just defending herself. She was defending the principle that everyone deserves the chance to be heard, especially in a democratic forum designed for discussion, not disrespect. Then, with the same level voice, she added something that shifted the entire mood. "You can disagree with me, but you won't silence me." That line cut straight through the politics of the moment. It was no longer about left versus right, or even about media bias. It was about the right to speak freely and to do so without fear of humiliation. Karoline was pointing out, without needing to say it directly, that silencing tactics come in many forms. Sometimes they're blunt and obvious, but sometimes they're disguised as snide comments, dismissive tones, or cheap insults intended to belittle rather than challenge. And she wasn't having it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone of being unprofessional. She didn't walk out in protest. She stayed rooted, physically and emotionally, in her seat. That quiet presence, the refusal to be shaken, was what caught people's attention. It wasn't about scoring points. It was about principle. Her composure stood in stark contrast to the moment that preceded it. Where Jasmine Crockett's comment had come off as performative and flippant, Karoline's reply was grounded and sincere. She wasn't trying to win the moment. She was trying to elevate it. And people noticed. The cameras that had captured Crockett's interruption now zoomed in on Karoline's expression. She wasn't smug. She wasn't rattled. She was firm. The kind of firm that speaks to years of navigating tough rooms without losing your sense of purpose. The kind of firm that women in politics, media, and leadership roles know all too well. Staying steady while being underestimated, holding your ground when it would be easier to walk away. Even some of those who typically disagreed with her politically couldn't help but acknowledge the grace in her response. It's not easy to remain calm when someone publicly tries to reduce you to a stereotype. And yet Karoline didn't just defend herself, she exposed the tactic without making it personal. Her words were measured, but they carried a deeper message. If civil discourse means anything, it has to apply to everyone, not just those you agree with. In the minutes following her statement, there was a noticeable shift in the room. A few people who had previously appeared dismissive now sat upright, perhaps realizing that something more important than a partisan exchange had just taken place. And outside that chamber, viewers across the country began to share clips of Karoline's reply, not because it was fiery, but because it was fearless. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't insulted back. She had simply reminded everyone watching that being underestimated is not the same as being defeated. And sometimes, the strongest response is the one delivered calmly, with clarity and conviction. As the tension from the exchange lingered in the hearing room, Karoline Leavitt didn't stop at simply defending herself from a dismissive remark. Her initial response, calm and composed, had already caught everyone's attention. But what she said next would transform the moment from a political spat into something far more impactful, something that would resonate beyond party lines. She paused, let the silence settle, and then, with deliberate clarity, delivered a statement that would surprise not just the room, but the country watching. We tell young women across this country to be strong, to speak up, especially when the room gets uncomfortable. So I won't sit down, not now, not ever. In just a few sentences, Karoline had shifted the entire dynamic. What had begun as a condescending jab from Reper Jasmine Crockett, the now infamous sit-down girl, was turned on its head. Karoline's words didn't retaliate. They didn't mimic the insult. Instead, they elevated the conversation, framing her response in a way that connected with something larger. The challenge women often face in being taken seriously when they're outspoken, particularly in high-stakes, male-dominated arenas like politics and media. Her statement wasn't just personal, it was universal. Suddenly, the moment wasn't about party affiliations or political ideologies. It was about how we treat people who dare to raise their voices. It was about respect, dignity, and resilience. Karoline's tone wasn't theatrical. She wasn't looking to score a viral clip. She was delivering a message grounded in experience, not just her own, but one shared by many women who have had to defend their place in the room. Some in the chamber shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others, even some on the opposite side of the aisle, listened intently. In the aftermath of the original insult, many had expected Karoline to get flustered or respond with sarcasm. But instead, she leaned into the moment and reframed it into something meaningful. And in doing so, she disarmed the entire situation. What she had done, intentionally or not, was remind everyone that dignity under pressure is still one of the most powerful tools a person can wield. She didn't need to talk over anyone. She didn't need to insult back. She stood in contrast to the disrespect she'd been shown, and in that contrast, she made her point louder than any outburst could. Cameras zoomed in. Journalists quickly took notes, and within minutes, the quote began spreading online. Not just among conservative voices, but from political analysts, commentators, and ordinary viewers who saw in her words something sincere and admirable. There were even prominent journalists not known for favoring the right who tweeted that her composure was impressive and that her message transcended politics. People from all backgrounds began to share stories online, personal, anecdotes about being interrupted, talked over, or dismissed in public or professional settings. What Karoline had said resonated because it wasn't just about a single moment in a congressional hearing. It was about something far more familiar. The quiet struggle of being heard when others would rather you be silent. Even some who didn't agree with her politics admitted they respected how she handled the situation. It was hard not to. She hadn't begged for sympathy. She hadn't even asked for an apology. She had simply stated a truth, that speaking up is never easy, but it matters, especially when someone tries to diminish your presence. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, suddenly found herself under fire. What she may have intended as a flippant remark was now being replayed over and over, not because it was sharp, but because it fell flat next to Karoline's measured, values-driven response. By trying to dismiss her, Crockett had given Karoline a larger platform, and Karoline used it, not to retaliate, but to inspire. By the time the hearing wrapped up, it was clear that Karoline's response had done more than just defend her right to speak. She had reframed the entire event. What had begun as an uncomfortable exchange was now being discussed as a defining moment, not because of the insult, but because of how she rose above it. And in that moment, she reminded the country that grace under pressure still matters, and sometimes courage doesn't come in the form of a dramatic speech, but in a quiet, unwavering refusal to be silenced. In the hours that followed the hearing, clips of the interaction between Jasmine Crockett and Karoline Leavitt began circulating online, lighting up news feeds and timelines across social media platforms. While the initial moment, Crockett's sit-down girl remark, had sparked outrage, it was Karoline's poised and principled response that took on a life of its own. Her words, calm and unwavering, were being replayed on news shows, posted on Instagram stories, and quoted by pundits who recognized the moment as something bigger than a political dust-up. Within 24 hours, Stand Up Karoline was trending nationwide. It wasn't just conservatives or right-leaning commentators praising her. People from across the political spectrum, women's rights advocates, independent journalists, public figures, even several liberal-leaning talk show hosts, expressed admiration for the way she handled herself. Many noted that her response offered a rare and welcome departure from the usual theatrical or combative reactions that dominate the political stage. More importantly, Karoline's response sparked a broader national conversation. The spotlight wasn't just on her or on Crockett. It was on the culture that allows flippant disrespect to substitute for real dialogue. Americans began asking an important question. When did it become acceptable to mock someone's presence in a hearing instead of challenging their ideas? Op-eds quickly followed. Columnists from major newspapers framed the exchange as a cautionary tale about political arrogance. They warned against the tendency to dismiss people who disagree instead of engaging with them. One columnist wrote, "Karoline Leavitt didn't win the argument. She reminded us there was never supposed to be an argument in the first place. There was supposed to be a conversation." This wasn't the first time Karoline had faced scrutiny, but this time was different. She wasn't responding to criticism of her views. She was responding to the erasure of her presence, and doing so in a way that felt deeply grounded. As that clip continued to make the rounds, it became clear that her moment of grace had not only impressed her supporters, but had reached those who might never have listened to her otherwise. Soon, she was invited to appear on national morning shows. Some of the hosts expected her to seize the opportunity to lash out, but Karoline didn't take the bait. She reiterated the importance of open debate and respect across the aisle. When asked if she was offended personally by Crockett's words, she said, "It's not about offense. It's about the kind of example we set, especially in public service. I won't return disrespect with disrespect. That solves nothing." That response made headlines too. And in political circles, something else began happening, quietly, but significantly. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle began reflecting on how these hearings were being conducted. A few Democrats who had previously stayed silent reached out behind the scenes to acknowledge Karoline's composure. Some even conceded privately that the insult had been a mistake, a distraction from the important issues at hand. Meanwhile, grassroots organizations, including some nonpartisan groups focused on civic engagement and women's leadership, began citing Karoline's response as a teaching moment. A clip of her calm reply was played during a youth leadership seminar in Ohio. In a women's advocacy workshop in Arizona, her words, "You can disagree with me, but you won't silence me," were printed on a presentation slide. This wasn't about idolizing her. It was about recognizing that public courage doesn't have to be loud, that standing your ground without stepping on others still has power in American life. Karoline Leavitt had taken a moment that could have simply been another viral clash and turned it into a conversation starter. She reminded America that decency isn't weakness, and that the right to speak up, especially when someone tries to shut you down, still matters in a country built on free expression. And as more Americans watched the clip and read the headlines, it became increasingly clear. This wasn't just about two women in a congressional room. It was about how we treat disagreement. It was about whether we value ideas or only listen when we already agree. And most of all, it was about who we become when we're tested in the public eye, whether we choose noise or whether we choose principle. In a political era where noise often overshadows substance, the exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Karoline Leavitt offered something unexpectedly meaningful. While the incident began with a sharp and dismissive remark, "Sit down, girl," it quickly became more than just a headline or a viral clip. It became a revealing moment about character, poise, and the power of principled leadership in the face of public disrespect. Karoline Leavitt could have easily fired back. She could have matched tone for tone, escalated the moment, and contributed to yet another shouting match on national television. But instead, she did something far more rare. She chose restraint. She chose to lead with grace, to anchor her response in values rather than emotion. And in doing so, she flipped the entire narrative. This wasn't just about defending her right to speak. It was about affirming that respect is not optional in public discourse. It was a reminder that women in leadership, especially those who are young or underestimated, should not have to prove their worth by shouting louder or standing taller. Sometimes, the greatest strength is saying less, but meaning more. Karoline's calm response reframed the incident, not just for herself, but for many others watching, especially young women, aspiring leaders, and people across the political divide, who are tired of watching meaningful discussions devolve into personal jabs. In a few measured words, she turned a potential embarrassment into an example of how dignity and courage can still thrive in American politics. The national reaction said it all. What began as a moment of dismissal ended as a moment of unity, with people from vastly different political and social backgrounds agreeing on at least one thing. Karoline Leavitt handled herself with remarkable strength. She didn't shout to be heard. She simply refused to be silenced. Moments like these remind us that character still matters, that how we respond when we're underestimated speaks louder than any title or microphone ever could. And perhaps most importantly, that in a world where it's easy to go viral by being outrageous, it's still possible to earn respect by being principled. Karoline didn't just speak up, she stood up. Not only for herself, but for a standard of decency that too often feels lost in today's public square. And in doing so, she reminded America that sometimes the most powerful message is the one delivered calmly, with eyes forward and conviction intact. Because respect isn't something you demand, it's something you demonstrate. And in that moment, Karoline Leavitt didn't just defend her right to speak, she redefined what leadership